Before we share this profoundly moving story about courage, loss, and the extraordinary power of honoring those we have loved, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. What you are about to witness represents one of the most emotionally powerful moments in game show history, a reminder that behind every contestant stands a story of resilience that deserves to be heard and honored. Throughout the landscape of television entertainment, certain moments transcend their medium to become shared experiences that illuminate fundamental truths about human experience, grief, and the enduring bonds that connect us to those we have lost. The story of what occurred during a Family Feud taping in April 2024 demonstrates how personal tragedy can transform into public testimony, how private grief can become communal healing, and how one person's courage and vulnerability can create space for thousands of others to acknowledge their own losses and find meaning in continued living. What Daniel Morrison did during his final answer, and how Steve Harvey responded in that sacred moment, would create ripples that extended far beyond the studio walls into the lives of cancer patients, caregivers, and bereaved families across the nation. Daniel Morrison was 41 years old when he stood on the Family Feud stage, representing his family from Portland, Maine. He appeared healthy and energetic, his athletic build and warm smile giving no immediate indication of the profound medical journey he had completed just 8 months earlier. Daniel had been diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer at age 39, a devastating discovery that arrived without warning during what should have been a routine medical examination. The diagnosis had upended every aspect of his carefully constructed life. He had been working as an architect, designing sustainable residential spaces that reflected his commitment to environmental responsibility. He had been married to his wife, Elena, for 12 years, and they were parents to 2 daughters, ages 9 and 6. The cancer diagnosis transformed him instantly, from someone planning his future to someone fighting for the possibility of having a future at all. The treatment protocol had been aggressive and comprehensive, involving surgery to remove the tumor, followed by 6 months of intensive chemotherapy. Daniel had endured the physical devastation that cancer treatment inflicts, losing 40 pounds from his already lean frame, experiencing profound fatigue that made even simple daily activities exhausting, and confronting the psychological terror that accompanies uncertain prognosis. Throughout this ordeal, his family had been his anchor. Elena had reduced her work hours as a physical therapist to manage his care and maintain household stability. His parents had relocated temporarily from Florida to Maine to help with childcare and provide support. His sister coordinated meal deliveries from their community and managed the overwhelming logistics that serious illness creates. But it was his brother, Marcus, who had been his daily companion through the darkest periods of treatment. Marcus Morrison had been 2 years older than Daniel, a high school guidance counselor whose natural empathy and steady presence made him exceptional at his work. When Daniel received his cancer diagnosis, Marcus had immediately restructured his life to be available. He drove Daniel to chemotherapy appointments, sitting beside him during the long infusion sessions. He was present during difficult conversations with oncologists about treatment options and prognosis. He researched clinical trials and alternative therapies, helping Daniel navigate the overwhelming amount of conflicting information that cancer patients encounter. He made Daniel laugh during periods when laughter seemed impossible, sharing memories from their childhood and maintaining hope when Daniel's own hope faltered. Marcus had been not just a brother but a lifeline, embodying the kind of selfless devotion that transforms family bonds into something approaching sacred. The profound irony and tragedy was that Marcus himself had been living with his own hidden health crisis. He had been experiencing symptoms that he attributed to stress and poor sleep related to supporting Daniel through cancer treatment. He had dismissed his own fatigue and occasional chest discomfort as consequences of the demanding schedule he was maintaining. By the time Marcus finally sought medical attention, after Daniel had completed his treatment and received preliminary indications that his cancer was in remission, doctors discovered that Marcus had advanced heart disease requiring immediate intervention. The cardiac event that took Marcus's life came suddenly and without adequate warning. He died at age 43, just 3 weeks after Daniel received his official cancer-free status. The devastation of losing Marcus, particularly in the immediate aftermath of surviving cancer, had nearly broken Daniel completely. The grief that followed Marcus's death was complicated by survivor's guilt, by the cruel irony that Daniel had survived his life-threatening illness, while Marcus, who had seemed healthy and had devoted himself to Daniel's survival, had died unexpectedly. Daniel struggled with profound questions about meaning and purpose. He experienced clinical depression that required therapeutic intervention. He found himself unable to return to his architectural work for several months, the creative energy that had always defined him seeming to have died alongside his brother. Elena and his parents worried that Daniel might not recover emotionally even though he had recovered physically from cancer. The path back to functional living was gradual and painful, requiring therapy, medication, and the slow rebuilding of reasons to continue engaging with life. One element of Daniel's healing process had been a commitment to honor Marcus's memory through action, rather than remaining paralyzed by grief. Marcus had loved game shows, particularly Family Feud, which he watched regularly and often referenced in conversations. He had frequently joked that the Morrison family should apply to be contestants, insisting that their combination of diverse knowledge and quick thinking would make them formidable competitors. Daniel's sister had actually submitted an application to Family Feud, approximately 6 months after Marcus's death, framing it explicitly as a way to honor Marcus's memory and to give the family a shared positive experience after the trauma of the previous 2 years. When the producers contacted them to say they had been selected, the family viewed it as a meaningful opportunity to do something Marcus would have loved, and to demonstrate that life continued even after devastating loss. The Morrison family that appeared on Family Feud in April 2024 consisted of Daniel, his sister Rebecca, his parents, Joan and Robert, and his wife, Elena. They had prepared for the taping with an intensity that reflected both competitive spirit and emotional significance. During practice sessions, they often spoke about how Marcus would have approached particular questions or what answers he might have suggested. This practice of keeping Marcus present in their conversations was part of their collective grieving process, a way of maintaining connection with someone whose physical presence had been taken but whose influence remained powerful. They arrived at the studio in Los Angeles, carrying both excitement about the opportunity and the weight of the absence that defined their participation. The taping began with Steve Harvey's customary introductions and pre-game conversation with the families. When Steve reached Daniel and learned about his recent cancer survival, the host responded with genuine warmth and encouragement, celebrating Daniel's health and resilience. Daniel briefly mentioned that he was dedicating his appearance to his brother Marcus, who had passed away the previous year. Steve offered condolences, and the moment passed as the game began. The Morrison family competed against the Torres family from Texas, and both teams demonstrated strong performance and good strategic thinking. The energy was positive, the competition friendly, and the atmosphere reflected the enjoyable entertainment that Family Feud consistently provided. The Morrison family advanced through the rounds with solid play, winning the main game and earning the opportunity to play fast money for the $20,000 prize. The family decided that Daniel and his father Robert would be the 2 players for the fast money round. Robert played first, providing thoughtful answers that accumulated 153 points, a strong performance that put the family in excellent position. Daniel needed only 47 points to secure the victory. The stakes were meaningful but not overwhelming, and the atmosphere suggested a straightforward conclusion to an enjoyable episode. Daniel approached the fast money podium with outward composure that concealed the internal emotional complexity of the moment. Steve Harvey positioned himself to begin the questioning, maintaining his professional focus while also projecting warmth toward a contestant he knew had survived serious illness. The 20 seconds were set, and Steve launched into the rapid-fire questions that defined fast money rounds. The first question asked Daniel to name a place where people go to relax. He answered, "Beach," without hesitation. The second question asked him to name something people do to celebrate a birthday. He responded, "Eat cake," quickly and clearly. The third question asked him to name a reason someone might be running late. He said, "Traffic," maintaining the quick pace. The fourth question asked him to name something associated with royalty. He answered, "Crown," smoothly. Then came the fifth and final question, the one that would transform the entire moment from routine game show content into something that would resonate far beyond the studio. Steve asked Daniel to name something you would find in a hospital. For just a brief moment, Daniel paused. The pause was barely noticeable, perhaps a second or two, but in that space an entire universe of memory and emotion seemed to compress itself into the present moment. Then Daniel answered with two words that carried weight far beyond their simple meaning. He said, "My brother." The studio fell into immediate, profound silence. Steve Harvey, who had been maintaining his professional rhythm through the questions, stopped completely. His expression shifted from game show host to human being processing the emotional weight of what he had just heard. The audience sat in suspended stillness as the meaning of Daniel's answer registered. On the surface, the answer was correct. Hospitals contain many things, including visitors and family members who come to support patients. But everyone present understood instantly that Daniel's answer was not primarily about winning points on a game show. It was a statement of grief, memory, and love that had found expression in the only way available within the constraints of the game format. Steve Harvey stood looking at Daniel for several long seconds. Then, in a gesture that would become the defining image of the moment, Steve removed his suit jacket. This was unprecedented. Steve Harvey's carefully chosen suits were part of his trademark presentation, and he maintained his polished appearance throughout tapings as a matter of professional standard. But in this moment, the formal attire seemed to Steve to create a barrier between himself and a person experiencing profound emotional vulnerability. The removal of the jacket was a physical manifestation of removing professional distance, a way of signaling that what was happening transcended entertainment and required human presence rather than performance. Steve walked slowly to where Daniel stood at the podium. Daniel's composure had dissolved, and tears were streaming down his face as the grief he carried daily broke through the surface in this unexpected public moment. Steve embraced Daniel without words, and the two men stood together while Daniel sobbed. The audience remained silent, bearing witness to pain that required no explanation and that invited no superficial comfort. This was not a moment for applause or cheering. It was a moment for collective acknowledgement of loss and for recognition that grief does not follow schedules or respect boundaries between private and public spaces. After what might have been 30 seconds or a full minute, the passage of time becoming irrelevant in the emotional intensity of the moment, Steve spoke quietly to Daniel. His words were captured by the microphones but delivered with the intimacy of private conversation. Steve told Daniel that he understood the disport, pain of losing someone central to your existence. He shared briefly that he had lost his own father and understood how grief could ambush you in unexpected moments. He said that Daniel's answer was the most honest and meaningful response he had ever heard in all his years hosting Family Feud. He told Daniel that Marcus would be proud of his courage in continuing to live and to honor his memory through that continued living. Daniel, struggling to regain composure, spoke through his tears about Marcus's role during his cancer treatment and about the cruel irony of surviving cancer only to lose the person who had been most instrumental in that survival. He described feeling that he was living partially for both of them now, trying to honor Marcus's life by living fully and by pursuing meaning. He said that appearing on Family Feud was something Marcus had wanted them to do together, and that standing at the podium felt like having Marcus present in the only way that was now possible. The raw honesty and vulnerability of Daniel's words created a space where others in the studio found themselves crying as well, connecting their own experiences of loss to the specific grief being expressed before them. Steve made a decision in that moment that reflected both professional judgment and human compassion. He instructed the production team to pause the taping. He told Daniel that they would take whatever time was needed before continuing. He brought water for Daniel and encouraged him to breathe and to take the space he needed to process what had emerged. Steve's response modeled a kind of leadership that prioritized human welfare over production schedules, and that recognized some moments required acknowledgement rather than efficiency. The production crew, many of whom were visibly emotional themselves, supported this decision without hesitation. When Daniel indicated he was ready to continue after approximately 10 minutes, Steve suggested that they might skip revealing his answers and simply award the family the victory and the prize money, given the emotional circumstances. But Daniel, in a statement that revealed the strength of character that had carried him through cancer treatment and grief, said that he wanted to continue properly. He wanted to see whether his answer about his brother was on the board. He said that Marcus would want him to finish what he had started, and that incomplete things felt wrong when life itself had been so brutally interrupted by Marcus's death. Steve honored this request, recognizing that Daniel needed the dignity of completing the task rather than being excused from it due to emotional circumstances. They proceeded to reveal Daniel's fast money answers. Beach for a place where people go to relax was the number 1 answer with 34 points. Eat cake for something people do to celebrate a birthday was the number 2 answer with 23 points. Traffic for a reason someone might be running late was the number 1 answer with 29 points. Crown for something associated with royalty was the number 3 answer with 12 points. Daniel had already accumulated 98 points before the final answer was revealed, meaning he had secured the victory, regardless of whether his last answer appeared on the board. But everyone in the studio needed to know whether my brother was listed for something you would find in a hospital. Steve approached this final revelation with visible emotion. He said that regardless of what the board showed, Daniel's answer was the right answer in every way that mattered. Then the board revealed that family member was the number 4 answer with 8 points. The phrasing was different from Daniel's specific words, but the essence was identical. Marcus had been there in the hospital, present throughout Daniel's treatment, and that presence was now acknowledged on the board in front of millions of eventual viewers. The studio audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. People were applauding, not just a game show victory, but a moment of profound human truth. Steve Harvey embraced Daniel again, this time in celebration rather than comfort, though the two emotions were intertwined inseparably. The Morrison family joined Daniel on stage, all of them crying and embracing, in a collective release of grief and love that had been seeking expression throughout their healing process. Steve announced that he was personally contributing an additional $10,000 to the family's winnings in Marcus's honor, and that he wanted them to use it in whatever way felt meaningful as a memorial to someone who had clearly been extraordinary. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Daniel's answer and Steve's reaction became one of the most shared pieces of content in Family Feud history, viewed tens of millions of times across various platforms. But what made this response particularly meaningful was the nature of the engagement. Comment sections and social media posts were filled with people sharing their own stories of loss, their own experiences with cancer either as patients or caregivers, and their own struggles with grief that persisted long after the acute crisis had passed. Daniel's public vulnerability had created permission for others to acknowledge their own pain and to speak about losses that often remained private and unacknowledged. Cancer support organizations and grief counseling centers reported increased engagement from people who had seen the episode and felt motivated to seek support or to participate in healing activities. The visibility of a cancer survivor speaking openly about survival being complicated by subsequent loss resonated with many people whose own experiences of illness included layers of complexity that popular narratives about cancer often simplified or ignored. Bereavement specialists noted that Daniel's willingness to express continuing grief more than a year after Marcus's death challenged cultural expectations that grieving should be completed within socially acceptable timeframes. His honesty about ongoing pain normalized the reality that significant losses create permanent changes in how we experience the world rather than wounds that simply heal and disappear. Steve Harvey spoke extensively about the experience in subsequent interviews and on his various media platforms. He described the moment as one that had changed his understanding of his role as a host and as a public figure. He said that his instinct to remove his jacket had been driven by a recognition that formality and professional distance were inappropriate responses to profound human pain. He spoke about how the experience had reinforced his belief that television at its best created space for authentic human experience rather than manufacturing artificial emotional content. He shared that he had remained in contact with Daniel and the Morrison family, checking on their well-being and maintaining a relationship that extended beyond the transactional nature of a single episode appearance. The Morrison family used the prize money and Steve's additional contribution to establish a memorial fund in Marcus's name that provided financial assistance to families dealing with serious illness. The fund specifically supported the often invisible costs that medical crises create, such as transportation to treatment centers, temporary housing for family members, and basic necessities when income is disrupted by caregiving responsibilities. The fund's creation reflected the Morrison family's desire to transform their pain into practical support for others facing similar challenges, honoring Marcus's legacy of selfless care by extending similar care to strangers navigating their own medical crises. Daniel returned to his architectural work with renewed sense of purpose, specializing in designing healing spaces and consulting with medical facilities about creating environments that supported both patient well-being and family presence. His personal experience with cancer treatment and with supporting a loved one through medical crisis informed his professional approach, and his work gained recognition for its sensitivity to the emotional and psychological dimensions of healthcare environments. He spoke publicly about his cancer experience and about losing Marcus, using his professional platform to advocate for better support systems for both patients and caregivers who often neglected their own health while caring for others. The broader impact on public discourse about grief, cancer survival, and family caregiving was substantial and measurable. Multiple media outlets produced segments examining the challenges faced by cancer survivors after treatment concludes, including the psychological difficulties of returning to normal life, the ongoing fear of recurrence, and the complicated feelings that arise when survival comes at various costs. Healthcare providers incorporated discussions about caregiver health and well-being into their protocols, recognizing that Marcus's death, while caring for Daniel, represented a pattern that occurred with troubling frequency when caregivers prioritized others' health over their own. Mental health professionals emphasized the importance of addressing survivor guilt and the complex emotions that arise when life continues after profound loss. Educational institutions, teaching medical professionals, social workers, and counselors incorporated the Family Feud clip into curriculum, examining patient-centered care, the importance of acknowledging emotional dimensions of illness experience, and the ways that healthcare systems often failed to support the full spectrum of needs that serious illness created. The moment became a teaching tool for demonstrating how vulnerability and authentic expression could create connection, and how professional helpers needed to balance expertise with human presence. Medical schools used it to discuss the importance of seeing patients as whole persons embedded in family systems, rather than as isolated individuals with discrete medical problems. 3 years after the original taping, Daniel was invited to participate in a special Family Feud episode, featuring previous contestants whose appearances had created particularly meaningful moments. Steve Harvey's reunion with Daniel was emotional and warm, reflecting the genuine relationship that had developed between them. Daniel provided an update on how the Morrison family had continued to heal and honor Marcus's memory through the Memorial Fund and through their individual commitments to living meaningfully. He shared that his daughters, now 12 and 9 years old, had grown up hearing stories about their uncle Marcus, and understanding that grief and love were inseparable dimensions of family life. Steve revealed during this reunion episode that he had visited Marcus's grave during a trip to Maine, paying respects to someone he had never met, but whose impact he had witnessed through Daniel's grief and through the family's response to loss. Steve said that standing at Marcus's grave, he had felt profound gratitude for the reminder that his platform as a television host carried responsibility to honor authentic human experience and to create space for stories that mattered beyond entertainment value. He announced that his foundation would partner with the Morrison family's Memorial Fund to expand its reach and support additional families facing medical crises. The long-term psychological impact on Daniel himself was complex and ongoing. He continued working with a therapist to process his cancer experience and his grief over losing Marcus. He described himself as permanently changed by the combined traumas of facing his own mortality and losing his brother. But he also spoke about discovering strengths and capacities he had not known he possessed. He said that appearing on Family Feud and having his grief acknowledged publicly had been unexpectedly healing, creating a sense that his pain had been witnessed and validated by thousands of people who had responded with compassion rather than judgment or dismissiveness. Elena, Daniel's wife, spoke about how the Family Feud experience had marked a turning point in Daniel's grieving process. She described how he had been stuck in a kind of emotional paralysis before the taping, unable to fully engage with present life because of survivor guilt and unresolved grief. The public expression of his pain, and the overwhelming compassionate response from viewers, had somehow given him permission to continue living, without feeling that moving forward betrayed Marcus's memory. She noted that grief remained a daily presence in their family life, but that it had transformed from something that paralyzed Daniel into something that motivated him to live with greater intention and purpose. Medical professionals who treated Daniel during his cancer journey reflected on how his story illustrated the importance of addressing psychological and emotional dimensions of cancer care alongside physical treatment. His oncologist noted that Daniel's survival was medically significant, but that the emotional aftermath of survival required support that healthcare systems often failed to provide adequately. She spoke about how cancer treatment protocols focused heavily on eliminating disease, but provided insufficient resources for helping survivors rebuild their lives and process the trauma that treatment itself created, even when treatment was successful. The episode continued to circulate widely years after its original airing, regularly resurfacing on social media during Cancer Awareness Month and during holidays when people experienced acute grief for absent loved ones. Each circulation generated new waves of comments from people sharing their own stories and finding comfort in seeing their private pain reflected in Daniel's public expression. The enduring resonance of the moment suggested that it had touched something universal about human experience, about the persistence of love beyond death, and about the courage required to continue living fully after devastating loss. 10 years after standing at the Family Feud podium and answering that final question, Daniel reflected that the moment had become a defining point in his life narrative, a moment when private grief became public testimony, and when personal loss transformed into connection with thousands of people he would never meet. He described feeling that his appearance had served a purpose, beyond winning a game show, that his vulnerability had created space for others to acknowledge their own pain, and to recognize that continuing to live and love after loss was not betrayal, but rather the most profound form of honoring those who had died. The story of Daniel Morrison's final answer and Steve Harvey's response demonstrated several fundamental truths about human experience, media responsibility, and the nature of grief. It showed that authentic emotion could not be manufactured or scripted, and that audiences responded to genuine human experience with depth of engagement that entertainment alone could never generate. It illustrated that public figures and media platforms carried responsibility to handle vulnerable moments with dignity and respect, rather than exploiting them for dramatic effect. It revealed that grief was not a problem to be solved or a weakness to be hidden, but rather a testament to love that persisted beyond death and that deserved acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Steve Harvey's decision to remove his jacket became symbolic of the kind of leadership and presence that honored human complexity rather than reducing it to content for consumption. His willingness to pause production, to prioritize Daniel's emotional needs, and to respond with empathy rather than maintaining professional distance, modeled an approach to public life that balanced role responsibilities with human responsiveness. His ongoing relationship with the Morrison family demonstrated that authentic connection could emerge from brief encounters when both parties approached the interaction with sincerity and respect. For families facing similar combinations of medical crisis, loss, and complicated grief, Daniel's story provided both validation and hope. It validated the reality that survival could be complicated rather than simply triumphant, that grief could persist long after acute loss, and that moving forward required courage rather than simply time. It provided hope through demonstrating that meaning could be constructed from tragedy, that love could be honored through continued living, and that vulnerability could create connection rather than isolation, when expressed in environments that responded with compassion rather than judgment. The medical and mental health communities recognized the Morrison family's story as an important case study in the complexities of cancer care, caregiver burden, and bereavement support. It highlighted the need for more comprehensive support systems that addressed the full spectrum of needs that serious illness created, including psychological support for patients, health monitoring for caregivers, and bereavement resources for families navigating loss. The story contributed to ongoing advocacy for policy changes that would provide better funding for these support services and better integration of emotional care into medical treatment protocols. As this profound story reaches its conclusion, the fundamental lessons about love, loss, and continued living remain powerfully relevant for anyone navigating grief or supporting others through similar experiences. Daniel Morrison showed extraordinary courage in allowing his private pain to be witnessed publicly, trusting that vulnerability would be met with compassion rather than exploitation. His willingness to complete the game despite emotional overwhelm demonstrated that strength and vulnerability were not opposites but could coexist within the same person at the same moment. His commitment to honoring Marcus through continued living and meaningful action illustrated that grief could be transformative rather than merely destructive when met with support and given expression through constructive channels. If this story has moved you or reminded you of the enduring power of love and the courage required to continue living after profound loss, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who might need the reminder that grief is not weakness, but testament to love. That vulnerability can create connection, and that honoring those we have lost means choosing to live fully, rather than remaining frozen by pain. Daniel Morrison's answer. Those two simple words, spoken through tears at a game show podium, reminds us all that the people we have loved and lost remain present in how we choose to live, in what we value, and in how we respond when asked what matters most. His brother was in that hospital throughout his treatment. His brother remains present in his continued living, and in that truth lies both the pain of loss and the possibility of meaning that can emerge when we choose to transform grief into love expressed through action, connection, and the courage to remain vulnerable in a world that often demands we hide our deepest truths.